Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 141st episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And as it's Mental Health Awareness Month, and this week's theme is mental health and loneliness, we're going to be focusing on loneliness and the impact on mental health. Now, maybe this is your first show or you're a regular listener. If you enjoy the show, then please leave me a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast from, and leave a review. And I'd love to hear from listeners. So if you contact me via Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn, please be assured that I will always respond to you personally. Okay, so Mental Health Awareness Week, running from the 9th to the 15th of May, is led by the Mental Health Foundation. And this year, they're raising awareness of the impact of loneliness on our mental well-being and the practical steps we can take to address it. And loneliness is, in fact, affecting more and more of us in the UK and has had a huge impact on our physical and mental health during the pandemic. And of course, for those people who might choose to shield or have medical health conditions or don't feel that they want to interact the same way they did pre-pandemic, this is also going to have a big impact. And also, I don't know about you, but I have really been thinking about this recently, and it's an interesting one. And I think the pandemic has made me feel like much more of an introvert. And whereas I would have been very keen to connect with people, I now feel much more in a shell and really struggled to reach out and talk to people perhaps in the same way that I would have done. So I can't be alone in that. And I think that also has an impact on loneliness or how we might feel lonely, because our connection to other people and community is fundamental to enhancing and as part of our daily well-being plan. And we all, I think, in this society need to find better ways of tackling the epidemic of loneliness. And if you want to hear more about mental health and connection, do check out episode 75, entitled How Love Promotes Positive Mental Health. And in that episode, I talk about all types of love and connection and how it helps our mental well-being. So we could say that potentially loneliness is subjective. Often people talk about having loads of friends or being in the middle of a party and joking and laughing, but ultimately they don't feel great. They feel quite lonely. And equally, we might see people who are doing something very in an isolated way. Maybe it's video games, maybe it's crafting, but they're really content and they don't feel lonely at all. So really, loneliness is that unwelcome feeling of lack or loss of companionship. And of course, if we enjoy our own company and we're doing something that brings us joy, we might be alone, but we're not lonely. And on the flip side, we might be in amongst lots of people, but we might not feel a sense of connection, and therefore we might experience loneliness. So it's that mismatch between the quantity and quality of social relationships that we have, and those often that we want and we don't know how to get. And loneliness affects people of all ages and from all backgrounds. From someone who might struggle to make friends at school, maybe it's a parent. We talked about maternal mental health in last week's episode, so go check that out, where we talked about feeling isolated, potentially anyone from an elder from older generations who may have outlived their friends and family and they feel really isolated. And I think we can all associate with some kind of feeling of loneliness that might have impacted us at some point. But being lonely can become a serious problem when it becomes a day-to-day reality, and over time that can grind us down. So of course that's going to affect our health and well-being and really make it more difficult to connect with others, which is what's happened with the pandemic. And just to share some stats with you from the wonderful Jo Cox's commission loneliness report. So they commissioned a report, the Jo Cox Foundation, and set up a kind of year-long loneliness commission. And this was published in 2017, 2018. And they pulled out stats from different organizations. So in this report, it talks about the fact that over 9 million adults are often or always lonely, which is a huge number of people, that 50% of people who identify as disabled will be lonely on any given day. If we think about the barriers and the way in which society is shaped for people who are non-disabled, you can see how that's the case. That for 3.6 million people aged over 65, television is the main form of company. 43% of 17 to 25-year-olds using Action for Children's services experienced problem with loneliness. Over half of parents have had a problem with loneliness, with 21% feeling lonely in the last week when the survey was conducted. 38% of people with dementia said that they'd lost friends after their diagnosis, and none of these statistics are insignificant in any way. 58% of migrants and refugees in London described loneliness and isolation as their biggest challenge, and we know that's only become worse. What's been happening in the world since the report was published, and it was still ongoing then. 8 out of 10 carers have felt lonely or isolated as a result of looking after a loved one. And do check out my episode with Anita Powell around recognizing the needs of carers. And more than 1 in 3 people aged 75 and over said that feelings of loneliness are out of their control. And more than 1 in 10 men say they are lonely but would not admit it to anyone. And I've put the link in the show notes to the report. So if you want to see more of those stats and really absorb them, I think it's absolutely tragic, but really helpful to see them written down. And that number of 9 million adults, that is a phenomenal number of people. And then if we think about meaningful work and that should be good for our mental health. And it's thought that people who have meaningful employment are less likely to report feeling lonely because there's a community and connection at work compared to those who are unemployed or economically inactive. And I think if we add to that the stigma and the expectations of society, what it means to be unemployed, can you really talk about that freely? That's all very loaded. And there are a myriad of ways in which work has changed for so many of us. But I think that it can feel lonely if you want to work in a particular way and you can't, or maybe your colleagues have changed, you didn't get to say goodbye to them, and all of that has an impact. And interestingly as well, just a few more stats for you from the Community Life Survey statistical release, which looked at additional demographic breakdowns, found that overall 6% of adults aged 16 and above in England said they were often or always lonely, whilst 21% said they were never lonely. People who identify as heterosexual were less likely to say that they feel lonely often than people who identified as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. Again, if you live in a deprived part of the country, you're more likely to report feeling lonely. And that, of course, that could be to do with access to activities and community centres and groups that least deprived parts have more readily available access to. And interestingly, people who did formal volunteering at least once a month were less likely to say they felt lonely, often or always, than people who did not volunteer. And that makes a lot of sense to me, actually, because you create a community based on shared values. And do check out my episode on how volunteering supports your mental health if you want to know more. So if we focus on workplace loneliness, that refers to feeling disengaged and disconnected from work and your colleagues and your peers. And this lack of connection with the people that you work with can lead to feeling detached from an organization, which can then result in an increased risk of depression, anxiety, and or stress. Now, this won't be the case for everyone. I think many people like to have that separation and think, well, I don't need to be friends with my colleagues. I can just do my work and be civil. But for some people, this will have a significant impact. Now, the cost of loneliness to UK employers has been estimated to be around 2.5 billion, and that is the New Economics Forum estimating that report that was done a few years ago. And this is linked primarily due to increased staff turnover, as well as lower well-being, productivity, ill health, and associated sickness absence. And recently, the City Mental Health Alliance research carried out in partnership with Bupa revealed that 69% of young professionals had experiences of loneliness that had negatively impacted their mental health over the last year. So as many organizations establish new ways of working, we really must think about workplace cultures that put connection at the heart of the workplace. So all staff, no matter their location, how they're working, should be able to form some kind of community with their colleagues and organization. Because of course, not only is it good for our mental health, it's really good for your workplace culture and therefore good for business and therefore good for profits. So I really hope you're enjoying the content of this podcast and you want to keep up to date. And if you are, please, why not join my bi-monthly newsletter? You can join my mailing list. The link is in the show notes. But just in case you've got a pen and paper and you want it, write it down. It's bit.ly/DMSYNR. And don't forget, you'll receive a free e-copy of my book, The Mentally Healthy Leader. So I'd love to be able to just say to you, okay, I've got the ideal solution. I know what we need to do. But I think this is a really tricky thing to solve and to even talk about or admit. And I think, again, people who have families and maybe it seems like they've got a really happy family can still feel lonely. And we never know what really goes on behind closed doors. And people can feel painfully lonely. They can feel like they don't belong in their families. But how do you articulate this without stigma and judgment? And there'll also be huge peaks and troughs and periods of time where we don't feel lonely for a long time, and then we can feel lonely as a result of something. So what can we really do when we feel lonely? And I think the first thing is to recognize how you're feeling, that there's a disconnect between how you want to be connected and how you are connected with other people, and realizing that there is stigma around it. But how could you communicate that? And maybe it's not through words, maybe it's through a piece of music, maybe it's through writing, doodling, drawing, anything at all. But I think the first thing is to recognize how you're feeling. And then often when we feel lonely, we can't remember the connections or people that care about us. Some of the characteristic feelings of being lonely are that no one cares about me, no one wants to know, I can't burden people with my problems, and we think no one wants to spend time with us. So it can be really useful to write down all the people that you trust and that you would talk to and that have been there for you throughout your life, to give you that sense of abundant connection, and to think about who you might like to talk to. And also remember the stats I've read out. It's not that it's good that these stats exist, but realizing that actually loneliness is really, really common and you're not alone. And maybe if you feel that you don't want to talk to someone in your friendship group or family group, then there are lots of helplines and charities that are trained in supporting people. And knowing that loneliness is going to look different at different times in your life. Like, thank goodness we don't have to stay at school forever and make friends. But it might be that you've recently become a parent, and for some reason that was what you wanted. You feel really happy, but you're also feeling really, really lonely. And sometimes it's just about taking a step back and thinking, okay, I do feel lonely. I don't like this feeling, but maybe it's just time for me to do something that will absorb me and make me feel a bit better and distract me for this time before I work out what I want to do. Another tip that I've seen is about spending time in nature, so connecting with nature. So do check out my episode on how nature helps your mental health, and the link is the show notes. And also Karen Livengood's episode 125 on doing less and being more. That's a really lovely episode. I often go back and listen to it because I found it so helpful. It's also thought that giving back can really help loneliness. Now, I think one of the issues that might have is that when we feel lonely, our confidence can be really dented. So if you feel more, your confidence isn't on top notch, or you feel quite lonely, you're less likely to want to engage and do something. So what are the small things that you could do that could get you out of your temporary shell to make you feel like, I want to get involved and do something with other people? And then people often talk about adopting a pet. And I know, the procurement and people having dogs has really, really gone up through the pandemic because pets are so useful. And maybe you could borrow someone's dog. Maybe you could borrow someone's, do some cat sitting. If animals are your thing, that can be a really, really useful thing to do. I think also checking social media usage, because of course no one curates negative profiles of themselves, or very rarely do people say, I feel really awful, I feel really low. There might be one or two posts here and there. So thinking about, does my social media help or does it hinder my feelings of loneliness? So of course we know it can be really, really useful, but often it can make us feel like, oh, everyone's out there having a great time and I'm really not. I know that I've definitely felt like that in the last couple of years. And try and be realistic and honest with yourself about what you can do. It can feel like, oh, I've got to just start doing things and I've got to just keep going. And sometimes that isn't the best thing. It's thinking I'm going to do something small and that is my one thing. And it might seem small, but actually it's a really big thing. And not everything is going to make you feel better. And we talk about this a lot, but if you try something, keep going for a while. And when you remove it, you can often feel the impacts that actually that was really working for me. And remember that if we're having dark thoughts and they're making us feel really low, that it's vital to work with a mental health professional, go speak to your GP, call an organization like the Samaritans, lots of resources available. But I think it is tricky because I don't think there's one quick fix to this and to loneliness. But it's also important to think about, how do we engage with people who we suspect, or we might have a sense that they're feeling lonely and they really want someone to support them. So loneliness is real and can affect anyone. It's hard to talk about. There is a lot of stigma about it. People's social media profiles don't necessarily show how they feel. It can be a slowly approach with ourselves and with others, but it is about knowing what we can take control of, and we do have some kind of choice about how we want to engage. So I really hope you found this episode for Mental Health Awareness Week useful. So please don't forget to leave me a review if it's your first show or if you're a regular listener, and do tag me in if you want to mention me on social media and I will respond. And don't forget, you can leave me an anonymous message on SpeakPipe, which is a platform that you can leave a voicemail on. And the link is in the show notes, but I'll also give it to you here. Again, it's bit.ly/SPKPDMP. And tell me what you'd like me to talk about, other topics that you want me to cover, and the resources, the podcast episodes I've mentioned, the Joe Cox Foundation's Loneliness Report, and Good Housekeeping's Guide, 18 Things to Do When You're Feeling Lonely. So I really hope you've enjoyed the show, and I'll see you in the next episode. And take care, everyone, and wishing you a very positive Mental Health Awareness Week.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.